In 1970, the federal minimum wage was $1.60 an hour. That sounds like pocket change, but here's the thing. A minimum wage worker in 1970 could afford a modest apartment, put gas in the car, and eat 3 meals a day. It wasn't a great life, but the math worked. Today, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. It hasn't changed since 2009. That's over 16 years without a single raise. Meanwhile, rent has doubled. Groceries are up 30%. Gas, healthcare, education, everything costs more. But the federal wage floor has been frozen in place like a clock that stopped ticking. So, how did we get here? How did the minimum wage go from something a person could almost live on to something that barely covers a tank of gas? This is the timeline of minimum wage in America, from 1970 to today. And by the end of this video, you'll see exactly how the promise of a fair wage slowly fell apart. Let's start in 1970. The federal minimum wage was $1.60 per hour. Congress had raised it to that level in 1968, and at the time, it was at its highest purchasing power in American history. Read that last line again. When you adjust 1970's minimum wage for inflation, it's worth about $12.80 today. That's almost $5.50 more than the current federal minimum wage of $7.25. In other words, a minimum wage worker in 1970 had more purchasing power than a minimum wage worker today. Think about that for a second. A person working full-time at minimum wage in 1970 earned about $3,328 a year. That wasn't much, but rent was around $100 a month. Groceries for a family of 4 ran about $25 a week. A gallon of gas cost 36 cents. You weren't getting rich on minimum wage, but you could survive. You could rent a small apartment, feed yourself, keep the lights on, and maybe even save a few bucks each month. The minimum wage was never meant to fund a luxury life, but in 1970, it was at least enough to keep your head above water. Through the 1970s, Congress raised the minimum wage several times. It went from $1.60 to $2 in 1974 to $2.30 in 1976 and kept climbing. By January 1980, it had reached $3.10 per hour. On paper, that looks like a huge raise, nearly double in a decade. But here's the problem. Inflation was running wild. Prices were rising faster than wages. The oil crises of 1973 and 1979 sent energy costs through the roof. Food prices spiked. Rent climbed. Everything got more expensive at the same time. So even though the minimum wage nearly doubled from 1970 to 1980, workers didn't feel richer. They felt like they were running just to stay in the same spot. Then, in January 1981, the minimum wage hit $3.35 per hour. And there it stayed for the entire decade. Congress did not raise the minimum wage a single time between 1981 and 1990. That's 9 years without a raise, while prices kept climbing every single year. By the end of the 1980s, the purchasing power of $3.35 had eroded significantly. A minimum wage worker in 1989 could buy far less than a minimum wage worker in 1981. Even though both earned exactly the same hourly rate. The wage was frozen, but the cost of living was not. Congress finally acted in 1990, raising the minimum wage to $3.80 per hour in April, and then to $4.25 in April 1991. After almost a decade of nothing, workers got a modest bump. 2 more increases came in the mid-1990s under the Clinton administration. The minimum wage rose to $4.75 in October 1996 and to $5.15 in September 1997. The 90s were a strong decade for the overall economy. Unemployment was low. The tech boom was creating wealth. The stock market was soaring. But for workers at the bottom of the pay scale, the gains were modest at best. A full-time minimum wage worker earning $5.15 an hour in 1997 made about $10,700 a year. The poverty line for a family of 3 was around $13,330. So a single parent working full-time at minimum wage was still earning well below the poverty threshold. The economy was booming, but not for everyone. The gap between the lowest paid workers and everyone else was already widening, and the minimum wage, while higher in dollar terms than it had been in the 1980s, was still worth less in real terms than it had been in 1968. The minimum wage entered the 21st century at $5.15 per hour, and there it sat for 10 years. From September 1997 to July 2007, Congress did not raise the federal minimum wage once. That's the longest freeze in the history of the minimum wage. During that decade, the economy went through the dot-com crash, the September 11th attacks, 2 wars, and a slow recovery. Housing prices surged, healthcare costs climbed, college tuition skyrocketed, but the minimum wage didn't move. By the mid-2000s, $5.15 an hour was worth about $8.30 in today's money. A full-time worker earning that wage brought home around $10,700 a year before taxes. That wasn't enough to rent a 1-bedroom apartment in any state in the country at fair market rates. States started stepping in. By 2006, more than 20 states had set their own minimum wages above the federal level. Washington state was at $7.63. Oregon was at $7.50. California was at $6.75. The patchwork of state-level wages was growing because the federal floor had become irrelevant for millions of workers. The message was clear. If Congress won't act, states will. In 2007, Congress finally passed a 3-step increase. The minimum wage rose from $5.15 to $5.85 in July 2007, then to $6.55 in July 2008, and finally to $7.25 in July 2009. That final increase in July 2009 brought the federal minimum wage to $7.25 per hour. As of today, early 2026, it has not moved, not once. That's over 16 years at the same rate. The timing was brutal. The increase arrived right in the middle of the Great Recession. The economy was shedding hundreds of thousands of jobs per month. Banks were failing. The housing market had collapsed. Workers were just trying to hold on to whatever job they could find. A full-time minimum wage worker at $7.25 earned about $15,080 a year. That was above the poverty line for a single person, but well below it for anyone supporting a family. After payroll taxes, the take-home was even less. And here's what makes this moment so important. This was the last time Congress raised the federal minimum wage. Every year since then, inflation has quietly eaten away at what $7.25 can buy. The wage hasn't changed, but the world around it has. The 2010s were defined by a growing national conversation about minimum wage and a growing frustration that Congress refused to act. In November 2012, fast food workers in New York City walked off the job, demanding $15 an hour and the right to unionize. The movement was called the Fight for $15, and it spread like wildfire across the country. At the time, $15 an hour sounded radical to many people. Critics said it would destroy small businesses and kill jobs. Supporters argued it was the bare minimum needed to survive in an expensive economy. While Congress stayed silent, states and cities took action. California passed legislation to phase in a $15 minimum wage. New York followed. Seattle became one of the first major cities to hit $15. By the end of the decade, over 30 states had set their minimum wages above the federal level. Meanwhile, $7.25 kept losing value. By 2019, it was worth roughly $6.27 in $2009. A minimum wage worker in 2019 could buy about 14% less with the same paycheck than a minimum wage worker in 2009. The federal wage floor had become almost meaningless. Only about 20 states still relied on it, and most of those were in the South, where the cost of living was lower but still rising steadily. For workers in those states, $7.25 was all the law guaranteed, and it wasn't enough. Then the pandemic arrived and turned the labor market upside down. In 2020 and 2021, millions of low-wage workers lost their jobs. When the economy reopened, many refused to return at the old pay rates. For the first time in decades, workers had leverage. Employers had to raise wages just to fill shifts. Market forces did what Congress wouldn't. Companies like Amazon, Target, and Costco voluntarily raised their base wages to $15 or more. Fast food chains bumped starting pay just to compete for workers. The average hourly wage for low-skilled jobs climbed significantly, not because of a law, but because of supply and demand. But that doesn't help everyone. In 20 states, the minimum wage is still $7.25, the same rate set in 2009. For workers in Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, and other states with no state-level minimum above the federal floor, the legal minimum hasn't budged. At $7.25 an hour, a full-time worker earns $15,080 before taxes. The average rent for a one-bedroom apartment in America is now over $1,400 a month. That's more than the entire gross monthly income of a minimum wage worker. The math doesn't just not work, it's impossible. Meanwhile, California fast food workers now earn a minimum of $20 per hour under a 2024 law. Seattle's minimum wage is over $21. The gap between the highest state wages and the federal floor is wider than it has ever been in American history. So let's put this timeline into perspective. In 1970, the federal minimum wage was $1.60. Adjusted for inflation, that's worth about $12.80 today. A worker could rent an apartment, pay the bills, and live a simple but survivable life. In 2025, the federal minimum wage is $7.25, nearly half the inflation-adjusted value of what it was 55 years ago. It hasn't been raised in over 16 years. A full-time minimum wage worker today earns less than the poverty line for a family of two. The minimum wage was originally created to guarantee that no worker who put in a full day's labor would live in poverty. That promise has been broken, not by one decision, but by decades of inaction. Long stretches where Congress simply chose not to raise the wage while the cost of everything kept climbing. Some states have stepped up. Some companies have raised their pay voluntarily. But the federal floor, the wage that's supposed to protect the most vulnerable workers in every state, has been stuck since 2009. For millions of workers, that gap has slowly turned a full-time job into something that still isn't enough to live on. And that's why the debate around minimum wage never really goes away. Because for a lot of Americans, it's not just an economic argument. It's about whether a week of honest work is still enough to build a basic life.